So thank you everyone for joining us. You are here for Rebooting Your Emotional Sobriety, and we are so excited and grateful to have you here today. The League of Extraordinary People's mission and vision is really important to all the work that we are doing, both with presenting and then also supporting individuals and organizations. Our mission is to launch an educational and spiritual enrichment revolution to build hope, resilience, and healing through community empowerment. And our vision is to establish a transformational, integrative, and replicable self-healing center of extraordinary people. This residential community model will heal transgenerational trauma through a foundation of safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment of voice and choice, and purposefully elevating historical, ethnic, and cultural legacies. We're partnered today with Emerge Thriving. We have Amy here as well from that organization. And Emerge Thriving's mission is to reduce stigma surrounding health and to promote the power of health and wellness by partnering with mission-aligned wellness providers and community-centered organizations to host life-changing events, podcast conversations, and to provide valuable and low-barrier resources. So we're very grateful for Amy helping us organize this today. Just some housekeeping things before we get started. This is a safe and inclusive space, and we warmly welcome and thank you for joining us today. In order to share the powerful message of emotional sobriety with those who were not able to attend in person, we are recording the session, as I mentioned. And if you would like to maintain your privacy, we are inviting you to keep your camera off, and then you're also welcome to turn it on if you're comfortable doing so. And you can message me privately if you have any anonymous questions that you'd like to ask. And then you should have access in the chat function to also post those questions in the chat to everyone. We will have a short time at the end and we'll respond to selected questions. Before we get started, we want to invite folks to take a breath together with us if you're comfortable doing so. And we're going to do a four-sided breath together today. The picture that you see on your screen is that of a Hoberman sphere, and I have one here for us. So a four-sided breath, before I have you walk through it for 3 breaths together, is going to be an inhale for 4 seconds, a count of 4, hold for 4 seconds, and then an exhale of 4 seconds, and then hold again for a count of 4. So we'll do that together, and you can follow along and take 3 centering breaths with us. So in for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, and out for a count of 4, and then hold for a count of 4. And we'll do that 2 more times together. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and hold for 4. And once more, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and hold for 4. All right. Thank you so much. If you felt comfortable joining us for those centering breaths together, Hoberman spheres are a great tool to use as a breathing ball. And we're going to get started jumping into emotional sobriety and rebooting our emotional sobriety. The content that we're really focusing on through these sessions is from Tion Dayton's book with the same title, Emotional Sobriety. And to kind of introduce us to the content, I'm going to be reading a 2-paragraph excerpt, and then I'll be turning it over to Alfred White to continue the discussion with us today. So this section that we'll be reading the excerpt from is called We Can Feel Before We Can Think About What We're Feeling. I'll read that one more time. We can feel before we can think about what we're feeling. Emotions predate reason. Our emotional wiring, that is, our limbic system, is in place from birth, but our thinking wiring isn't in place until we're around 12, and even then, we're only beginning to learn how to use it. Because of this discrepancy in development, young children cannot use their thinking to make sense of and to regulate their emotional responses to life. We learn the skills of self-regulating initially through being in the presence of an adequate external regulator, say a mother or father. We depend on them not only to actually calm us down when we're upset, but to show us how to do that through their own behavior. When we get out of balance, they woo us back into a state of balance. They hold us physically and emotionally until we restore our own calm, until our nervous system settles. Gradually, we absorb the ability to do that for ourselves. We internalize their regulation and make it our own. Through a successful attachment, we gradually build these skills into our own self-system and make them portable. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Alfred to continue our conversation here, and I'm going to go help my dog regulate. Thanks for being here, Alfred.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good morning. My name is Alfred, and today we're going to discuss setting up your healing network, and this is in chapter 22 of the book, Emotional Sobriety. And it's talking about learning the skills of mind, body, and emotional self-regulation. So that's beautiful what Melissa did with the breathing exercise, because in order to gain control over the skills of the mind, body, and emotional self-regulation, we need to first look at controlling our body and our mind through the breathing exercises. And so to get centered in the morning is a good way to center ourselves after waking up. And also if you're looking at healing your mind, body, soul, and spirit. Another way of setting up your healing network is resolving childhood wounds so they don't undermine your self-regulation. So I myself come from an adverse childhood environment, and I experienced adverse childhood experiences. So resolving my childhood wounds was really, really powerful and important for me when I was in treatment. And I want to let you guys know, because part of the League of Extraordinary People is empowering those who might be chronic utilizers or chronic high utilizers of public funds. I was one of those guys. And so I stayed in an inpatient behavior modification treatment program for 2 years. And so I got a chance to start actually looking at some of these things in my childhood wounds. Also learning effective and healthy ways of self-soothing. And so the reason why I had Melissa review the We Can't Feel Before We Think About What We're Feeling is because how many individuals in the room today had parents that sit down and actually nurtured you? Or do we know what nature and nurturing means when it comes down to emotional sobriety? So developing emotional literacy so emotions can be talked out rather than acted out, that's part of parenting. Maintaining a healthy body, getting regular exercise and rest is another important part of setting up your healing network. Next, please. Another important fact is processing emotional ups and downs as they happen. That's part of nurturing. So we all came here in the shape of nature, but did we get enough nurturing from our parents, especially between the ages of 1 to 3? 90% of our prefrontal cortex and our thinking is actually not our prefrontal cortex, but 90% of our brain is developed by the time we're 3 years old. And then also part of setting up our healing network is learn to constantly shift between thinking and feeling states. And that's something that we'll discuss later on in this book study today. Learn to use the thinking mind to regulate our feelings, developing inner resources, quiet, meditation, spiritual, and pursuits, and then actually knowing why we need to develop these inner resources, the quiet time, the meditation, and the spiritual pursuits. Developing outer resources, a strong relationship network, hobbies, social life, and a supportive community. All these are part of our limbic brain and areas in our life that we need to work on if we're going to set up a healing network. I like the quote in this chapter. It says, talk doesn't cook rice. And so we all know that talk doesn't cook rice. So that means that we need to do the work when we're setting up our healing network. And also, are we going to operate out of integrity, or are we going to still operate out of a self-centered notion? Next. The pair of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. This slide here is featuring what adverse childhood experiences looks like from the child's side, and when they're growing up into maternal depression, emotional and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, divorce, mental illness, incarceration, domestic violence, and homelessness. But we never mentioned very much about the adverse community environments that our moms and dads are involved in. And so they already, before we even get here, experiencing poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunity, economic mobility, and social capital, poor housing quality and affordability, along with violence. The elephant in the room that the Adverse Childhood Experiences study is talking about, you guys, is the statistics. And so it's basic information. How many people grew up in homes where your parents actually had enough money to help nurture you in your journey? And that means that when you experience poverty and discrimination and community disruption, what does that look like for you? Did your parents have an equal living wage? Next slide. Here's something that we really need to focus on today in this book study on emotional sobriety, and that's the early development. And that's the caregiver with traumatic experiences. And so that's your moms and dads. And when we talked about, when we flip between the slides, if we was to flip between the slides, and we looked at the two trees and a pair of aces, and you look at adverse childhood experiences, and you see that your mother releases the cortisol and the baby absorbs the cortisol through the placenta, this can impact the baby's HPA axis. And so how many of your parents do you think even knew this information? So they want to send us to treatment today. And actually, for some areas in life that our parents never even really had the basic information about what's going on.
Alfred,
So, yes.
I'm going to ask you to pause for just one moment. Are folks seeing the slides that we are on, or is it still on the title slide for people? Can folks let me know, either maybe Amy, if you can pop on, or let me know in chat?
We can hear the slide.
So you are seeing the slides. Okay, so it's moving past. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Sorry about that, Alfred.
Not a problem.
So you were just saying about with this caregiver's trauma and how it relates to those pair of ACEs, the environments and the adverse childhood experiences.
It's basically more about the information as a caregiver, parents knowing exactly what's going on in their bodies. And so, and that's that the mother releases the cortisol. So during early development, if your mom or dad has grew up in an adverse community environment, of course, it's going to impact the mother's cortisol, because there's going to be a lot of anger, as you can see in the pair of ACEs where it talks about emotional neglect and physical neglect. So that impacts our HPA axis. Our HPA axis stands for the hypothalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary and adrenaline glands. And then it impacts our central nervous system, our limbic system, and our autonomic nervous system. And also it impacts the caregiver struggles to regulate. And so that's the homeostasis, and that's living between the windows of tolerance. When we talk about the windows of tolerance, we're talking about those who are hyper-aroused or individuals who are hypo-aroused. And so if you're hyper-aroused, that's anxiety, overwhelm, chaotic responses, outbursts, emotional or aggressive, anger, aggression, rage, rigidness, obsessive compulsive behavior or thoughts, overeating, restricting addictions, and impulsivity. And then also too, if you're in hypo-aroused, that's when you're disassociated, not present, unavailable, shut down, memory loss, disconnected, automatic pilot, no display of emotions, flat, separate from self, feelings and emotions. These are the areas that actually a lot of individuals relapse. And they might not just be on drugs and alcohol, it could be on gambling, it could be on sex, it could be on food, because they don't understand the attachment or information that should have been given to the caregiver during the age-appropriate time. So the attachment relationship between the caregiver and the child may be strained. And that's from them not actually spending enough time with the child. Between the ages of 1 and 3, a child needs to experience the facial expressions of the mother. This can impact the child's development of a core sense of self and ability to integrate experiences, especially epigenetic expressions. And so for those of you who don't understand very much about the epigenetic expressions, that's when the two pairs of ACEs, the adverse community environments and the adverse childhood experiences, they come together as one. And what they do is they alter our DNA, they alter our genetic expression. And so that during adulthood, a person who has had a caregiver with untreated trauma may be more prone to PTSD after trauma, struggle to repair after conflict, unintentionally bring out negative behaviors in others, to be emotionally attached and prone to more prone to disassociate. The emotional sobriety book and emotional sobriety workbook it talks about from relationship trauma to resilience and balance. And this is looking at the science of it. This book is by Tion Dayton and myself as a chronic utilizer of adverse drugs and behaviors. It's imperative that I learn all about relationships and trauma and resilience and balance. Another important factor in this is the limbic system. Next slide, please. The limbic system, the survival mode, is called a flight, fight, and freeze, actually, and rest. And then also too, we need to talk about a little bit today about our prefrontal cortex, which goes offline, and the limbic system, the mind and the lower brain functions take over. And so a lot of us, including myself, I've actually been living in my emotional brain. My emotional brain is my limbic system. And so revealed in our deepest emotions through psychobiology, love, fear, anger, dread, grief, sorrow, disgust, and hope involve the activation of our bodily structures. And these structures, which is a complex system of nerves, connect the brainstem, the heart, the lungs, the stomach, and the gut, and the spine. And this system, you guys, is called the wandering nerve, or our vagus nerve, or in some other books like my grandmother's hands, it's called the soul nerve. The soul nerve is connected directly to the part of our brain that doesn't use cognition or reason as its primary tool for navigating the world. Listen to me, the soul nerve is connected directly to a part of our brain that doesn't use cognition or reason as its primary tool for navigating the world. Our soul nerve also helps mediate between our body's activating energy and resting energy. This part of our brain is similar to the brain of lizards, birds, and lower mammals. Our lizard brain only understands survival and protection. And so when you look at this screen here and you see the survival mode, think of all the different times when you thought you was thinking, but then you really realized that you wasn't thinking because you wasn't even accessing your thinking and learning brain. And when you ask yourself about emotional sobriety, how many individuals in here would say that they even know anything between the difference between their limbic system and their prefrontal cortex? So when individuals send people to treatment for long periods of time, is it really treatment that they need, or is it information that they really need? In my particular journey, where growing up in adverse childhood experiences, I realized at the age of 49 that I was still operating as a child in many ways. I never did really activate my learning and thinking brain because I'd never been prepped to it during my childhood, through my parents, through my environment. And I don't want to blame my parents because in actuality, they was having lived experiences themselves in their relationships. So when you look at the two trees again, and you look at how that impacts your life even today, and you look at maternal depression. So how many people today are sitting in the rooms today and actually having maternal depression or physical and emotional neglect in their lives? What about divorce, mental illness? And I don't like to use that term mental illness. That's a nasty word for me. I'd rather call that self-regulation, because that's how I learned how to manage myself. After spending 2 years in a behavior modification treatment program, you guys, I didn't address none of my mental illness. I didn't know it was mental illness, because another reason why is because mental illness is a label that actually traumatizes people, because nobody wants to be called, you got some mental illness. And then homelessness. A lot of us had homes, but we felt less in our homes because in actuality, there was too much critical oversight on our parents' parts, and then trying to survive the domestic violence, not only domestic violence of our parents, but the domestic violence between our brothers and sisters. And then if we had a parent during those times when I grew up, substance abuse was really related to alcoholism. It wasn't crack and opiates. There was opiates around then, but there wasn't crack. There was always cocaine around, but it wasn't accelerated like it is today as crack and meth. And then emotional and sexual abuse. How many times did we hear that in our households? And then the maternal depression, and it talks about maternal depression, it talks about our moms. And then if they're growing up in poverty and they're experiencing discrimination and community disruption, and that's racism and a lack of opportunity and economic mobility and social capital, that's being redlined, not being able to move where you want to move, and then poor housing. A lot of us are growing up, we grew up in houses that had mold in them, you know, and the air quality. A lot of us who lived who are Black and indigenous and people of color grew up in areas that used to be formerly garbage dumps, or in areas close to where toxins are being spilled out into the air. And then also, what about the violence, the attacks on one another, because we actually grew up in an adverse community environment, so that we're fighting amongst each other. And so emotional sobriety, you guys, is all about a wake-up call. And that actually to take a look at the science behind what's going on into our neurobiology. We don't have psychological problems, we have physiology problems. And so what's happened is the environment has impacted our bodies so hard and so strenuous that and so stressful that we don't even really realize what's going on. In the book by Dr. Joy DeGroot, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, she talks about the Maasai warriors and saying, and how are the children? When we look at the pair of aces, and you ask yourself today, we have everything. We have electric cars, we have cell phones, we have things I could never even imagine that we had when I was a child. And you ask yourself, how come we're still having adverse childhood experiences amongst our youth? And we have trillionaires in the country. It doesn't make any sense. And so the common denominator in this is the adverse childhood experiences study. If you look at the adverse childhood experiences study, 63% of people in San Diego had one ACE, and that was from middle class California. So if you look at the demographics, how many people of color do you think actually have ACEs? If you go to our website, the League of Extraordinary People, you'll be able to see exactly through the ACE questionnaire, exactly what might be your deficits. We also have a resilience questionnaire where you can find out what your strengths are.
Alfred, on this slide, we see the mention of maternal depression as one of the adverse childhood experiences. Can you kind of connect that to what we see on the caregiver trauma slide here?
Yes, that's important too. So the mother releases the cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone, and it's mentioned in one of the handouts that we have reference here. And it comes, and the cortisol impacts the baby's placenta, which can impact the HPA axis, and that's the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and adrenaline. And so cortisol is the main stress hormone. It is longer lasting than adrenaline and sustains the effort required after initial fight or flight by keeping blood pressure high and releasing glucose to power the muscles and brain to remain hypervigilant. Maybe you've climbed over a fence to get away from the dog, but you now have to run to your car because the dog is digging a hole under the fence to reach you. Meanwhile, as cortisol builds up, it eventually alerts the hypothalamus that the immediate danger has passed and stops sending alarm signals. If there are no further alert messages from the amygdala, the increasing cortisol also signals a part of the nervous system that calms the brain. You guys, I'm here to tell you that we didn't get enough information growing up in order to be able to see these things that are happening to us. And it's happening to our physiology, and this physiology impacts our genetics, and it impacts our DNA, and it causes transgenerational PTSD. It also causes what we're experiencing today, and that's a whole lot of racism. We've actually, race is an invention. And in order for us to be able to understand what we really need to do, we need to start looking into our bodies and our brains. And so the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 1998 measured 10 types of childhood trauma. 5 types were the usual suspects: physical, sexual, and verbal abuse, physical and emotional neglect. And 5 were family dysfunction. A member of the household is addicted to alcohol or other drugs, a household member who is in prison, a household member with a mental illness, a mother who is a victim of domestic violence, and a loss of a parent due to separation or divorce. And there are other types of adversity also. For instance, witness a sibling being abused, being bullied at school, witnessing neighborhood violence, experiencing a natural disaster. Another thing that you need to understand is that the experiences from adverse childhood experiences influence health and well-being throughout the lifespan, meaning that our childhood experiences actually influence our health and well-being throughout the lifespan. From adverse childhood experiences comes disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors, intergenerational transmission of these health risk behaviors, and the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. Our social, emotional, and cognitive impairment are tied into our vagus nerve. And also, too, it impacts our disease, disability, and social problems and early death. Our vagus nerve is our social and emotional nerve. It's how we feel safe and calm. And so in actuality, we have 2 different brains. Our vagus nerve actually is in our gut. And we have 4 different ways of communicating through our gut that is not expressed during childhood. And one of them is our nervous system, our hormonal system, our electromagnetic system, and our pulse system. A lot of us don't even understand we're actually more charged electromagnetically than anything else. That's the reason why frequencies and things like cell phones and computers and TVs impact our brain, our bodies, and our languages. And so when we look at all this information that we're sharing here today, the ACE study and the emotional sobriety book, the emotional sobriety, you guys, is just so you can start wrapping your thoughts around this. When it talks about emotions predate reasoning, our emotional wiring, that is our limbic system, is in place from birth. But our thinking and wiring isn't in place until we're around the age of 12. And even then, we're only beginning to learn how to use it. Only then, at the age of 12, I left home at 13, you guys. And how I got into this is through actually working on myself. I stopped believing in what they were telling me at treatment agencies because everybody that I was experiencing who was counselors never knew what my life was about. They didn't look like me. They didn't make the same income that I made, and they didn't go home to the same neighborhoods. They didn't have the same adverse childhood experiences that I had. So how we can take external care providers and bring them into the community doesn't really make sense. So that's the reason why my focus is on the Black and Indigenous and people of color. Another thing that we need to realize that because of this discrepancy in development, young children cannot use their thinking to make sense of and to regulate their emotional responses to life. So think of it, when you was a child, what was your childhood like? What do you think the childhoods were like of those who was experiencing adverse childhood environments? And then when you look at what's going on in the world today, and we're talking about truth, how many actually trust science? How many actually trust the truth? Or do you even know what the truth is? So since our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex doesn't come online until the age of 12 or 13, how many people are still thinking they're operating and living out of their limbic system, where we just talked about that's impulsive and compulsive? It's rigid. We have addictions. We're overwhelmed. We have chaotic responses. We have outbursts, emotional or aggressive, anger, aggression, and rage. In actuality, we're in a fight or flight response. And then in a freeze response, we're in a disassociation, not present, unavailable, shut down, memory loss, disconnection, autopilot, no display of emotions. And then when you go to the doctor's office, they tell you to take a pill. You guys, I'm sorry to explain this to you, but another reason for the emotional sobriety book is for you to understand that it's not in our brains, it's actually in our bodies. Our learning and thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex, doesn't start to develop until the age of 12. So when we're talking to a lot of adults today, we're actually still talking to a lot of individuals who are still operating from the realm between 1 and 12. And they're using the limbic brain, and that's to rest, fight, flight, or freeze. Take a real good look at the individuals that you're helping and really figure out, have they been getting treated fairly all their lives? And so how adversity affects the developing brain science shows that in the absence of protective factors, toxic stress damages children's developing brain. And stress alters developing brains, and whether the changes are adaptive or maladaptive for the person depends on the context. Toxic stress is the body's physiological response to events or environments where the stress response is sufficient to cause maladaptive changes. These are the kind of stresses that cause problems in our lives. And so the stress response to living for months or years within a screaming alcoholic, how many people still remember their childhood? All that stuff has turned our body on the inside. So unless we start looking at our internal locus of control, which is what the emotional sobriety book study is all about, and this workbook, we're going to have problems. So in these severe circumstances, kids need stress hormones, a normal survival response. So was you ever taught as a child what the normal stress response was? Did your mother or your dad come over and nurture you and actually help you get from your sympathetic nervous system to your parasympathetic nervous system? Or did they just walk away and ask you to figure it out on your own? Is that the reason why we're not present when our emotional brain kicks in or our limbic system kicks in? Is that the reason why we need help from therapists and to help access our learning and thinking brain or our prefrontal cortex? So as to remain hypervigilant, and a lot of us who have been living with lack of emotional sobriety actually live in a hypervigilant world. And it's terrifying, and it has unpredictable circumstances. And so when we lived in a world that's in constant danger, when you look at the TV and you look at the news and you wonder why that you're going through anxiety and depression and people are having suicidal ideations, is because they're triggered and their survival brain takes over, literally shuts down their ability to think, learn, and make decisions. And the slightest provocation, even an accidental bump from another individual may trigger them into their fight, flight, or freeze mode. They may lash out, bite, throw chairs, run away, or withdraw into themselves from the outside world. So when we look at ourselves in our emotional sobriety, how many individuals who's actually in this group today really need to take a stronger look at their emotional sobriety and need to separate it? We need to take a more whole person-centered approach at looking at our lives today. I'd say this, I think that I had to find out this on my own, and that was to learn how to know my value better. I think it's very important that we learn what our limbic system means, and that the limbic brain, that's sometimes called survival brain, is something that we have in common with all animals, and it's kept humans alive for millions of years. That's because when there's anger, the limbic brain, specifically the amygdala, sends out a red alert signal fast in your thinking so that your thinking can't even be comprehended. You can't even access your thinking if the limbic system takes that message and takes it straight into your body. The limbic system protects your body, and the brain protects your mind from your body's reaction. And so if you're not getting enough software updates about your learning and thinking brain, and you keep living out of your limbic system, there's going to be problems and challenges, and you wonder why we're such a ready state. Any questions from you, Melissa?
I just wanted to say I really like what you pointed out there of like the analogy of a software update. And, you know, I think from what I'm hearing is almost that like emotional sobriety has been that software update for you, has allowed you to kind of access that software update as you worked through the book and the workbook and things like that. Is that kind of an accurate evaluation there?
It actually allowed me to assess myself to actually find my resiliency to process my emotional ups and downs as they happen. And then I also did the research just so I can learn to constantly shift between my feeling and my thinking stage, and actually to have some quiet time to develop that space I needed to be able to constantly shift between my feeling and thinking stage. And then learning to use the thinking mind is what I found out through emotional sobriety to regulate our feelings. But when I did that, I didn't understand the repercussions of my lack of self-regulation or lack of mental health. And it wasn't because I had mental health problems. My parents never knew the significance of updating my software to learning about the inner resources, quiet meditation, spiritual pursuits, or developing outer resources, a strong relationship network, and hobbies and social life and supportive community. When you really start doing the work and processing your emotional ups and downs, it's best to have a somatic therapist, because you need to learn the skills of our mind, our body, and our emotional self-regulation. How many individuals really realize that you never got the software updates when you was a child to be able to be a healthy adult? So don't feel bad about this, and don't keep letting your childhood wounds undermine your own self-regulation. This is a good place and a good platform for individuals who are struggling, especially the Black and Indigenous and people of color, to learn about the effective and healthy ways of self-soothing, and learning effective ways to manage stress, and developing emotional literacy so emotions can be talked out rather than acted out. That's the reason why there's so much violence in the community. When you look around, we never got the software updates. Nobody ever told us that we was actually the cash crop. Yes, the Blacks and Indigenous and people of color have actually been America's cash crop. If you look at it and you look at all the reports, even the Monahan report, it talks about they brought in outside external regulators, or actually external providers, who come in to try to make us whole. There was nothing wrong with us from the beginning. This is equivalent to what they did to the Native Americans when they started having these individuals come out and create reservations. So we're sitting on this reservation now, and they're not even giving us enough information of equal proportion so we can even be able to understand our physiology and our brains, so we can set up our own healing network. That's the reason why it's important that we start developing self-healing, resilient communities. What I was trying to share with you from the beginning, from the Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome book by Dr. Joy DeGruy, is the fact that through adversity and trauma, from being totally cut away from our culture, we no longer have a way to even acknowledge who we are, or actually even how to repair ourselves. The only difference in between us is the color of our skins. So we're all mammals, and we need to understand what that looks like and how we need to be treated. When they say that Black Lives Matter, it means that not only does Black lives matter, but all individuals matter. We are created as one. And that's another problem with our relationship, is the emotional sobriety, is so we can actually get a chance of looking and evaluate who we are as an individual and as people, so we can move forward together. We can't assimilate to the white culture, so it's time to take the trauma-informed care guiding principles approach to be able to come together as one. And so I love the millennials and the movement when they talk about Black Lives Matter, because what they're really saying is our physiology matters. And in order that we're all interconnected as humans. And so unless we start respecting each individual as one, we're going to continue to have the problems that we're having out here in the community. But you know, there's some good news, and the good news is that the brain is plastic and continually changes its wiring in response to the environment, and that the toxic stress stops and is replaced by practices that build resilience. The brain can slowly undo many of the stress-induced changes and return to baseline. Listen to me, and return to baseline. You guys, no matter what has happened to us, this active process of trying to return to baseline is called allostasis. But if there's no intervention, kids or adults can fall behind in school or life, fail to develop healthy relationship with peers, or create problems with teachers or husbands and wives and principals and employers, because they're unable to trust adults. Some kids and adults do all three. With despair, guilt, and frustration pecking away at their psyches, they often find solace in food, alcohol, tobacco, methamphetamines, opiates, or drugs, inappropriate sex, high-risk sports, and don't regard these coping methods as problems. Constantly or unconsciously, they use these as solutions to escape from depression, anxiety, anger, fear, and shame. Did you hear me? And depression, anxiety, anger, fear, and shame started during their early childhood, when they was actually in their mother's womb, when the life around them that was being played out in the adverse community environments and the adverse childhood experiences was not made available to them because they never got the information. How many people have bought a new car and never got a book? So they just look at it. How many of us have been born and we was never treated fairly? We didn't get the right information. And so the emotional sobriety, you guys, is for us to embrace a continuum care modality of care for our families, especially in our communities. And I'm saying this, you guys, as a guy today who's fighting all the outcomes of adverse childhood experiences. And Veronique Mead from the Chronic Illness and Adverse Babyhood Experiences has a fact sheet out. And she can tell you exactly how adverse babyhood events affect risk for disease. And so things like maternal loss or trauma through their life, lack of loss of support for their mother, mother's serious emotional stress or illness, mother's physical stress symptoms or illness, maternal complications, baby complications before, during, or after birth, maternal infant separation, low and high birth weight, baby did not or could not be breastfed, symptoms in baby appearance after birth. And it says that adverse babyhood experience refers to 10 categories of adverse experiences in mothers before conception. Did you hear me? Before conception, and in parents and babies in pregnancy, birth, until a baby's third birthday. Adverse babyhood experiences increase risk for infant and maternal morbidity and mortality, chronic illness, and further the science of adverse childhood experiences. So to provide opportunities for prevention and prepare, we need to bring this information into the forefront of our communities. Melissa, did you have a question?
Thank you so much, Alfred, for all that you've shared this last bit of time here. And as we wrap up, if folks have any questions that you'd like to ask about anything that we shared, any of the slides, you're welcome to drop those questions in the chat as we kind of continue to wrap up. And we really want to welcome you to continue investing in your well-being and just recognizing what Alfred called knowing your value, right? That you are worthy, you are valued, and deeply cared for. And we do have long-term continued care that is available through the League of Extraordinary People. So Alfred is a licensed mental health therapist, and you can find information either at our website, www.TLOEP.org for the League of Extraordinary People.org, and then also on openpathcollective.org as well. So those are some additional resources. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how this continued healing is going to look for actually doing the book study, if you want to be part of that for emotional sobriety. So again, like thinking in terms of what Alfred said, that this is like a chance to have that software update. And kind of get some new programming. And another way that Alfred describes it is like reparenting. And so if you want to be part of that, we do have a book club for the League of Extraordinary People, a Facebook group. So you're welcome to join that group. If you are on Facebook, you can participate to whatever extent you're comfortable with. So whether that is just being in the group and observing and lurking and seeing what's going on and what people are sharing, or it can be to an extent where you're participating as well. And then you can also stay in touch with both the League of Extraordinary People and Emerge Thriving through our social media links. And we're just very grateful for everyone for being with us today. And you're welcome to reach out to us at any time. And I'm seeing a comment coming in here. So for our question and answer time, we have a question, Alfred. How do we help our Black, Indigenous, and children of color who have complex trauma? How do we support them, and are there resources to help us help our children?
Well, that's an interesting question because it's deeper than what we're talking about here today, because there's another level, and it's called intergenerational trauma. And that's from parents who actually have adverse childhood experiences who have children. And so, you know, what's the problematic with that is getting the whole family into treatment, and that's the adults. And for the adults to actually start taking ownership of the changes that they need to make in their lives before they actually look at the child, because the child is responding to the environment. And complex trauma means that it's a series of post-traumatic stress disorders. And it's actually not disorders, they're just responses. Be careful of using the DSM, because the DSM isn't culturally competent. And another reason why that I'm even talking about this today is because I'm a child of complex trauma. And a lot of you guys don't know in my bio, but I went to prison at 49 years old. And then 9 days out of prison, I swallowed a 1/4 ounce of crack cocaine and died and was paralyzed. But since then, I purchased homes, started a nonprofit, and actually am fighting today fibromyalgia, liver cancer, and quite a few other autoimmune disorders. And so in order to do this, you have to take a whole person approach. So you have to take the whole family system approach in order to address this. And don't expect this to happen. This is a continuum of care program. So that's the reason why I look at the word treatment when they say that you need treatment. That's not true. We need life. And so we just need to look at what's going on in our lives and then sit down and be honest and operate out of integrity. Does that make sense, Melissa? The individual that asked that question, did that help them? Because what it's going to take is a somatic experience, body, mind, and spirit. You're going to have to approach all 3 spheres of life, but also you're going to need to have a baseline.
Exactly. And I think too, and Cynthia did share that did help. Thank you. That as far as resources to help support, you know, children specifically, it's going to vary by community. And I know we have folks from not only across the country on with us today, but from across the world. I saw we had at least one person on from Australia. So thank you for being here. And, you know, it's really going to also take us advocating, especially those of us who are in positions that offer us access to advocate to greater degrees, and really not just on an individual level, but also on that, you know, macro, that greater scale. Because especially for Black, Indigenous, and other children of color, there's not resources super extensively geared towards them. And so that's one of the goals we have with the League of Extraordinary People, is really creating a space where from pediatrics to geriatrics, that is something that we are offering support specifically for those children for. And, you know, just trying to navigate systems that already exist in the meantime, and trying to improve them to the greatest extent possible for the health and safety and well-being of those children.
Let me share something else for individuals that really might not really understand this. You know, I'm 66 years old, and before I got on this screen today, I had to remember that 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with needing a liver transplant. And so how I got here today is through all the things that you actually hear me talking about today. I actually had to do the work on myself in order to become resilient. I didn't really realize how resilient, how strong I was until I really started looking at the science behind the ACEs. Vernon Mead, who has a fact sheet, actually was what I took around to all my doctors to help them to start seeing where I needed to go to start healing. And so if you want to be a part of the solution, you have to start doing the work on your own. And so the most important book that I had that gave me that pathway was this book, Emotional Sobriety. So after dying and becoming paralyzed and then putting myself into a behavior modification program that was 9 months, that turned into 2 years, is actually the infrastructure for my healing today. And then after I got out of the treatment for my addiction, and then I went and worked in the institution, a hospital institution, where I created the most successful continuum of care program in the 75-year history of the hospital. And then I hit burnout. And then that's when you call it mental health, But then that's when my self-regulation issues came in, and that's how my body went further into unbalance. And so continue to do the work each and every day as outlined in the Emotional Sobriety Workbook, as outlined in the introduction to this Emotional Sobriety book, is paramount. Unless you have a foundation and a structure to address yourself from, stop thinking. Because I'm going to ask you, like I said to myself, with what, Alfred? You know, you haven't read any books, so if you want to learn something in life, hang out with people who read books. You know, go to school, learn something new. Stop being domesticated. You know, the Four Agreement book says, John Lennon has a quote in there that says, living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all we see. Melissa, any more questions?
Yeah, we had another question come through, and this is, I think, kind of a strategic question as well, is how can this be shared with school systems and cities plagued with violence? And I think that's another question that has a lot of layers to it. And again, what Alfred just said is that it's going to take the action and it's going to take the doing on the part of all of us. And, you know, people have different degrees of access to different systems that exist, whether it's the school system or, you know, within those cities to advocate for different reforms and changes. And so, you know, you're going to be welcome to share this recording with people if you have contacts. And then also, you know, we're available as well for consulting work. And so that's all information you can find on our website, and then just reaching out through the contact form to get connected. And then for those of you who are in, you know, different parts of the world, even just if we can be a resource where we help you find resources that are local to you and that are local to your community, because the people in your communities are best going to know, you know, what they need and what's really going to be able to help them start on this healing path.
I want to interject a point in here, Melissa, for that question, specifically to that question. What we need to do is create healthcare silos for the Black and Indigenous and people of color, period. And it needs to be culturally driven, and they need to have people that look like me in there that form these institutions, and people that look like me that work in these institutions. And no longer can the East Side be separated from the West Side because they don't have the financial money. It's not about money, it's about basic information, you guys. This is information before it even becomes education, before it even becomes wisdom. We need to supply the people of the Black and Indigenous and other people of color and people of color communities with the basic information. Stop placating individuals and stop by not telling them the truth. We live in two different worlds, and it's a time for us to assimilate culturally and embrace each other in love instead of so much hate.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. That's very appreciated. All right, so that's going to be how we kind of wrap up this session here. And we do welcome you to contact us if you have further questions or information that you're interested in. There will be an email going out to you that will have a copy of the slides so that you have that for your records if you want to go back and remember something from it. And then also, we will be posting the recording, so you'll have access to that afterwards. And then just as a note, these are some of the resources that we used and referenced today, either in the images or in the content that Alfred was sharing. And Alfred, can you just speak a little bit to the first one here, the Community Resilience Cookbook, and why that's such a vital resource for folks?
That's actually the breastbone of this whole situation. The individual that asked me, along with the lady that asked how that we involve, how we treat families, actually take that workbook and actually start doing that at home. I'm actually scrambling around here looking for my workbook now, which I can't see in front of me. But that's primarily the thing. Educate your family. Educate your family. Toxic stress of childhood adversity also affects our bodies, which results in long-term health consequences. Take this book home, download this book, and go home and have a real simple conversation with your family, your peers. Anybody who wants to bring this into their community or their homes, this is a good place to start. You can also call me. I'm open, and you can also contact me online.
Yeah, thank you for that. So this PowerPoint, when the information goes out, that link will be active, that you'll be able to access this, and you can also find it just from Googling as well. And then as a reminder, we will have the Facebook group that goes into depth doing the full book study using the emotional sobriety book as well as the workbook. So if you haven't gotten this book yet, it's not a requirement that you have the book to participate in the group, but it's highly, highly, highly encouraged. If you need support being able to access a copy of the book, let us know, because we don't want that to necessarily be a barrier to participating, and we can see how we can try to support getting a copy in your hands if you don't have the capacity to do so. So thank you so much again to everyone. Thank you, Alfred, for leading our time together today. It has been a really fantastic experience, and we're just so excited to be on this journey together with all of you.